Ready to go?
Yeah.
So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our monthly GPN speaker series. My name is Jackie Joyce, and I will be moderating our discussion today. Our guest today is Dr. Eric Toshalis. Dr. Toshalis has served in a variety of teaching and leadership roles in and around public secondary school classrooms and middle school classrooms for over 3 decades. In addition to his many peer-reviewed and practitioner-oriented articles, webinars, and online resources, Toshalis is the author of the award-winning book, Make Me, Understanding and Engaging Student Resistance in School from 2015, and is co-author with Michael J. Nuccola of the widely used text, Understanding Youth, Adolescent Development for Educators from 2006, both by Harvard Education Press. His next co-authored book, to be released by Pearson this summer, is the 13th edition of Comprehensive Classroom Management, Creating Communities of Support and Solving Problems. Dr. Toshalis provides equity-focused, independent scholarship and education consulting for a wide range of clients at engagingresistance.com. Now let me pass it over to GPN co-founder and associate director Andrew Babson and GPN founder and director Mike Nuccola.
Jackie, thank you. And we're excited today to welcome Dr. Toshalis and also everyone just to the speaker series in general. We started this a few months ago, and the purpose of the speaker series is to allow leaders in the field of youth development to highlight any of their latest and greatest thoughts, works, and to share them with us in an environment that we hope is a nice mix of formal and informal. So giving each expert a chance to deliver a talk, but also to have a chance for us to discuss and ask questions and get to know each other a bit. So, so welcome to our speaker series, and thank you, Dr. Toshalis. But before that, before we let him do his thing, we're going to hand it over to Mike Nuccola, who's the founder and director of the GPN. Mike.
Thank you, Andrew. It is a distinct pleasure today to have Eric Toshalis with us. Eric and I go way back, have done a lot of work together, and whenever there's an opportunity to hear Eric's ideas, it's a special opportunity. So he may have the developmental mentality of an 8th grader, as he said just a while ago, but it's part of what makes his insights so interesting. So Eric, I'll never forget the first time we met, and I appreciate all the work we've done together. So without further ado, take it away.
Right on. Thanks, you all. It's a real delight for me to be here. It feels like coming back a little bit of full circle here. Anytime I get to be working with Mike and his colleagues is a real treat for me. Basically everything I've done professionally since about 1999 has been touched or enhanced or facilitated by the brain that sits on top of those Nuccola shoulders there. Mike, still much appreciation for you and all you do, and what you've done in this GPN thing is just a beautiful manifestation of so much of what you've given to the field. So excited to be a part of it today, and thanks for having me. I'm a middle school teacher. 8th graders are my people. You will probably hear some of that passion for that age group in what I will say today. I also have never let go of the fervor of an 8th grader's sense of just righteous indignation about the wrongs in the world and the wrongs around me, and that's not fair, and slamming doors. I'm still that kid. I'm still that guy. I've looked for ways to suppress it for years and years and years. I just can't. It's me. So you're going to see that today. I'm going to try to be busting open a few things that I think we need to consider differently, and a few practices, or what I call malpractices in the field, that really hinder the way that I know that you all are constructing and thinking and building around issues of possibility. So my opening idea here is that mistakes should be stepping stones to possibility. And the way we're going to focus on that today is by investigating and interrogating, grading, ranking, and punishing in schools. Before that, just beyond the bio, just know, so you know my positionality and know how to hold me accountable, and also aware the things that I'll probably be have quite good facility in seeing, and the things that I won't be able to see by virtue of my background and the biases and blindnesses. I identify as white, middle class, cishet, non-disabled. I'm English monolingual. I'm 55 years old. I'm a father. I'm a foster parent. I'm an agitator, an independent scholar, an education consultant, and all these identities give me a lot of unearned privilege, which I try to use to open conversations and create opportunities and develop alliances to move against systemic injustice and promote equity that's developmentally responsive and in ways that are culturally sustaining. So I do it in flawed ways all the time. I make tons of mistakes. I trip over myself. I wake up and step in things I shouldn't. And then I try to learn from that and move on. I live in the Intermountain West in a weird state called Idaho. It's very beautiful, but man, the politics here are bizarro. My background has now included middle school, high school teaching, nonprofit sector leadership, and then now independent consulting and independent scholarship. And I just want to note that where I live sits on the stolen, unceded, and still occupied territories of the Shoshone-Bannock Nation of Indigenous people. And I recognize their sovereignty and their contributions that are ongoing in our communities and their struggle for sovereignty even now, even still. All right, that's me. So now you know what I can see and what I don't see often. But I want to open with a conversation, just quick, and we can put this in the chat. And this is a way to frame what we're going to talk about a little bit today, and then leave a lot of time for Q&A at the end. But what I'd like you to do is to think about how you would respond to this question. Give yourself 30 seconds, 45 seconds, 60 seconds, and type some things in the chat. And we'll start kind of summarizing that as a way to get into our conversation. And the prompt is, you failed. Okay, I want you to imagine imagine hearing that particular judgment about something that you did, perhaps who you are. What are you saying internally to yourself after you hear that judgment or after you sense that realization? And I'm asking you for your interiority here. I'm asking for your internal voice. What is it that pops up in your head? What is that part or that voice in your head that shows up when you hear or sense in your learning environment, or even wherever you are, that you're hearing from someone or somebody or some system that you failed? I'll give you a second to populate the chat with that a little bit. Oh no. Yeah. Betsy Bowman, I see you. I see you. Hi, Betsy. Great to see you today. Maybe I did fail. Why? What do I do now? How do I move forward from here? I tend not to see myself as a failure, but at times someone who does not fail and wants to learn from it. Yeah, that is a positive trajectory out of failure. I'm failing forward. Awesome. I am a failure. I suck. Yeah. Ugh. The range here is quite interesting because you can see that if you have a history of receiving messages about failure that lead to indictments of your own character or your own possibility, that you may tend to reproduce some of that. Whereas if you're practiced at seeing failure as, oh, well, then I got to learn from this. What should I do to get around this and get over this or get through this? What if this defines me? That's intense. Yeah, particularly when you're in an environment where that is cause for judgment about you internally, you and your relationships, you and the possibilities in front of you. Yeah. Ooh, Shirley, thank you. Of course I did. Wow, that hurts. Of course I failed. I never expected to be good at this. Or maybe I'm just learning. Of course I failed. I'm klutzy right now. I'm just trying this new thing. Right on. Okay. This is great. This is, why did I attempt this anyways? I knew my plate was too full. Yeah, totally. Yeah, that feels like a Friday thing to write. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, so what you sense here and what you can see here in the diversity of responses is that people come to this message with very different preparations for how to handle it with their own interiority, and then how to handle it externally with strategies to move forward from that moment. Taking in failure at the level of identity can be very, very toxic to growth possibilities, to relationships, to successes in environments where those things are judged routinely. Taking in failure as an indictment of potential can be soul crushing. And taking in failure as a temporary data point on the way to success can be an elixir of possibility development. Unfortunately, schools are often, if not mostly, really bad at these distinctions. The growth mindset subfield can be read in many ways as an attempt to steer that ship into a very different direction. Mistakes, errors, failures can actually be quite motivating if the context and the relationships are designed and tended in sufficient ways to promote it. And there are three big, glaring, persistent, and pernicious examples where this is often squandered in schools. And this is my own experience as a learner, my own experiences as a teacher, my own experiences as a teacher educator and a union president and a university teacher with intern teachers. I've seen these three things are the most glaring in my experience, and that is grading, ranking, and punishing in schools, which is where the toxicity around mistakes and failures are most glaring. So let's jump into the first one, which is grading. So by raising of hands, there should be a raise hand function here, or if you're on camera, you can just raise your hands and we can see it. Raise your hand if your school or system, and this could be the school or system where you taught, the school or system where you're currently teaching, or if you're not currently in a school or system, it could be the last one you remember attending as a teacher or as a student. Raise your hand if your school or system awards extra credit to compensate for past poor performances or to get a leg up on the competition. Yeah. All right. Raise your hand if your school or system deducts points for late work. Oh man, that's a lot of hands. Gives zeros for missed work. Oh, look at all the hands. All right. Assigns grades for behavior, effort, citizenship, participation, or attendance. Those grades go in the book for those things, for those behaviors. Gives points for practice, either in class or on homework. Disallows redos on assignments or retakes of tests. Or allows teachers to choose and invent their own ways to grade across any single institution, whether that institution is a state or a district or district consortia or an actual school or a department or a grade level. Yeah, pretty much consistent hands all the way through. And guess what? Everything on here has been studied, and all of the things on there are essentially really bad grading and assessment practices for learning environments. And yet they are common practice in schools. Now, it's a well-known secret that we don't want families and students to know that many common grading practices are really outdated. They're highly inaccurate, and they're very harmful. Okay. Are we essentially just grading for compliance and regurgitation in our schools? Way too often, that's what I see. Do we want docile workers who simply learn how to obey or game the system or play the school game, not get better at something and show that they're good at something, but just figure out what the teacher wants and how to give it to that teacher so that they can figure out how to get that grade and whatever grade they want, gaming the system? Because if that's what we want, man, we're really good at producing that, right? Our grading practices are often increase achievement gaps by infusing grades with teachers' implicit biases or by rewarding or punishing students based on their family's resources. I want to underscore that. Grades so often exacerbate existing differences in resource access, resource allocations, and ability for families to thrive. And grades exacerbate that such that kids who start school and get graded those grades tend to represent more just socioeconomic level or racial positionality more than they represent their skills in a particular area. This varies depending on the study and how it's studied, but it's a common finding if you look at assessment research. Equitable grading and assessment for learning is grounded in the belief that a grade should reflect what a student knows and can do. It should not reflect how they behave. It should not reflect how many attempts it took them to get to the right answer. It should not reflect how many worksheets they complete. It should not reflect whether they submit extra credit assignments. It should not reflect how much their lives outside of school affect their ability to complete work. In other words, so what does a B+ in algebra really mean? Like, what does that mean? You could put 30 different algebra teachers in front of me, and we're going to get 30 different explanations for what a B+ in algebra means. What does an A- in English language arts mean? Who can tell me what a C in world history is really meant to communicate? Does a B- for this kid mean the same as a B- for that kid? And if you get an F in a class when you first try something, but you later get an A on that same thing, should you get the averaged C? Does that make sense? Most grading regimes, that's what it looks like. We think that our politicians are the ones that talk in circles and evade important questions, but we're really good at saying a whole lot of nothing with our grades, people, and obscuring about what we're actually doing behind where the wizard works and deciding what magical dust I'm going to sprinkle on and what a kid is going to get because the kid did something that I liked. Grading is a mess. Right. So what are grades for? What should they tell us? The COVID backlash or the COVID era exposed a wide misunderstanding about what grades are and how they should be used. It also exposed huge biases and inequities in how we assess homework, how we account for missed work, how we account for absences, whether we allow for redos and retakes, and the criteria we use, if any, if we even have criteria, to determine competency. And since that time, there's been lots of talk of too much leniency, too much grade inflation, too much dumbing things down, where equity efforts have really created too easy opportunities for students to be successful. And that way, our grading post-COVID and during COVID has really demonstrated a regression more than a progression. I would argue that Feldman's book, Grading for Equity, which is about the single best source that I have ever found for defining all the problems and showing all of the solutions that are totally scalable. In that book, he articulates what grading for equity, what grades should actually be. Grades should be a reflection of growth over time, and they should reflect achieved competencies that are identifiable and understood with a shared in a shared community about what that competency actually measures and what it looks like when you get this level or that level or that level of competency. It should value knowledge and skills, not just circumstances or behavior. It should lift the veil on how to be successful. So you could ask any student at any time in any classroom, how do you know what you should be doing today? And how do you know you're going to be successful? Show me what it's going to look like when you get there. They should know what that looks like, and it shouldn't be based on the whims of the educator. It should offer flexible pathways and pacing so that students who enter with different levels of sophistication in the material can still excel and get enriched. And it should supply ample, varied, and regular ungraded feedback. Are you practicing? Here, practice this thing. I will give you feedback about how well you're doing as you move toward this competency, and I will not grade that feedback and put it in the grade book. I will just give you the feedback, and then you'll use the feedback to get better at it. So whatever mistakes or tweaks that you're using while you're trying that, we're focusing on the skills you're using to get better, not gotcha grading where, haha, you missed those 3 points, 70%, C in the grade book, try it next week. That's not helpful for learning, and it's not helpful for growth. This also should build soft skills without including them in the grade. In other words, participation, citizenship, those sorts of stuff. Those things, behaviors should not be graded. Academic competencies and skills should be graded. And it should eliminate practices that punish, i.e. the big one being zeros in the grade book. There's a fantastic 3-page article out there by Douglas Reeves called The Case Against the Zero. Be happy to supply a copy. It's widely available online. It's the single best resource that just describes how painfully bad giving zeros for missed work or for underdone work is for students in school, particularly when the grading scale stops at 60. We're giving a 0, we're subtracting, if it's a 100-point scale, 60 points worth of work by putting a 0 in the grade book, such that when kids try and they look at their grade and it's really not raising their grade much after they missed a few because their grandmother was sick or they went on a family trip or something, they can't get their grade back up to where it was because we've subtracted so much possibility from them with a really old grading regime. We have to be really careful about the damage that zeros does, not to mention just damage that zeros do, and not to mention the messages it sends about where you could be going. I'm just going to show this really quickly. Full disclosure, I used to work for a nonprofit organization called KnowledgeWorks that does competency-based education scaling at the state and district consortia level across the country. I got to see schools around the country that are well-versed or beginning in competency-based education. I've sat next to students in so many different classrooms and asked them about how they know what they should be doing and what they're motivated to do today and how they get the ownership over their learning. It is a game changer. The New York Competency Collaborative is among the most evolved in the country. Their online resources they provide, including this single explanation here, are really solid, and they do some beautiful blending with competency-based ed and culturally responsive and sustaining education so that the two very dovetail with each other to produce equitable outcomes. Big fan of competency ed to replace old grading regimes that we need to get rid of. All right, so that's grading. What about ranking, which is a sort of bugaboo word that basically is replacing what I'm talking about, which is tracking. And in this case, tracking means the labeling, ranking, sorting, and segregating of students based upon perceived ability. Now, as you may or may not know, tracking is rooted, unfortunately, in racist, classist, ableist, and xenophobic designs. There's the off-cited Carnegie claim that systems are perfectly designed to yield the outcomes that they produce. If you want to change the output, you got to change the design. Systemically, inequity is both a symptom and a core design principle of traditional models that are built on the need to label, rank, sort, and segregate human beings. In traditional schooling environments, during the industrialization era, students were placed on tracks with very finite destinations based on their factory or agricultural assumptions. There were farmers, ranchers, factory workers, tradesmen, professionals, higher level degrees. Future tradesmen sat next to other future tradesmen, and future professionals learned alongside other future professionals because they were tracked separately and understood to have very different trajectories in their later life. Women, of course, were raised kids, and many students of color were either sent away to indigenous Indian boarding schools or were given subpar educational opportunities until Brown v. Board just dismantled the whole system in the South. And you could live then on a single parent income. Tracking was and is designed to channel workers into specific sectors based on their racial, economic, and linguistic status, and a whole host of other things. That era that produced systems to make this specific tracking, that era is long over, but we still have tracking, and it morphed into and to protect intra-school segregation after the Brown decision forced schools to integrate. Tracking is a form of in-school segregation. Putting students on the same tracks today creates immeasurable problems and harms because these tracks really no longer lead to known destinations. They lead to cliffs where we don't know how students are going to fare because we haven't prepared them to function in complex learning environments that are competency-based. And these grading and ranking and sorting regimes were based on scientific management principles and measurement systems that were developed by anti-Black and anti-immigrant eugenicists. This is well documented, that were trying to prove that white superiority and sustained dominance. So they created systems that were based on intelligence or perceived intelligence that proved what it is they were looking for, which is, hey, white middle-class people are the smartest ones. Who knew? What a surprise that white middle-class dudes produced a system that made them the smartest, right? Segregationists made a policy. So we rank and we track to protect the dominant group's advantage. We need to be brave enough to admit that tracking continues to function. And here is where I'm suggesting different language that we talk about it. Tracking is a little bit too easy and clean. We need to call it what it is, which is a form of cognitive suppression, a form of educational redlining. It's privilege laundering for those that are design it and maintain it. It's opportunity hoarding for those that continue to benefit the most from it. It's intellectual apartheid for the way that it functions to label, rank, and sort kids in schools. And it's pedagogical racial profiling because of how much it's built upon assumptions about racial possibility for success later in life and even in school. So I encourage you to use words like these to talk about it because it shifts the dialogue when you start to hear those things versus tracking, which is now just, oh yeah, we track. But will people allow it if you say, yeah, we do intellectual apartheid here? Maybe not. Let's call it that. All right. Tracking is intentional. It's systemic inequity and it's unscientific. The research that details tracking's injurious effects, its racist logics, its disproportional outcomes, its discriminatory practices and desegregating policies is very, very well established in the field. The criteria used to determine when and how and where to track students have been shown multiple times, study after study, to be highly subjective, demonstrably biased and racist and classist and ableist and all those things, heteronormative, discriminatory in both intention and impact, dependent on long disproven notions of human intelligence. We now know the brain has enormous plasticity, enormous potential. There are new networks that can be rebuilt, not just when you're a baby or when you're a toddler or when you're an adolescent, but deep, deep, deep into adulthood and throughout the lifespan. The brain is capable of reorganizing itself given the proper context. Tracking goes both against the learning sciences and what research has reviewed to be the best practices in K-12 education. And I'll just post, there's a great summary by the National Education Policy Center and Kevin Wellner that you can find there. If that link didn't work, I can send it afterwards. And there's, yeah, really great stuff about it. I mean, importance, it's really, if we think about the way that we track in school, we have to think about the messages that it sends to students about their possibility and where they could go. And can you really say to 80% plus of your students that they're not gifted and untalented? Like, can you really say that? Because gifted and talented programs tend to be to the top 20 to 15% using all sorts of criteria that are deeply flawed, which means that all the students who never get those labels never get to be called gifted or talented in their work. And this is what it feels like to be waiting for the school bus, right? I think this cartoon is both funny and super tragic and sad. You know, once again, we're boarding only our elite premium passenger at this time. Thank you. This is how kids feel when they go to school, and the gifted and talented kids go down to this end of the school and get those kinds of teachers and those kinds of opportunities, and everyone else goes there. And I know because I was a gifted and talented teacher for 2 years, and that's what made me leave public school teaching. All right. Tracking, and this is where it gets into the possibility development, tracking confuses pace and path with capacity. Labels stick. Teachers and students and leaders use them, students and families internalize them, they become self-fulfilling prophecies. I'm remedial, I'm college prep, I'm AP, I'm gifted and talented, I'm a gate kid, right? Tracking leads students, educators, and systems to adopt the labels associated with the pace of learning in a specific track. Because of this, tracking adherents tend to confuse the pace of a particular learning opportunity or student in pacing with their capacity. Just because they're slowing down at any point means, oh, I happen to capture their possibility at that point. I'm now saying that's their life potential. They're only good at this point, they're only that good at this stuff, so they're never going to be good over here. What a horrible thing to say to, in some cases, we're testing 4-year-olds, but what a horrible thing to say to a 14-year-old, much less an 18-year-old or a 28-year-old or a 58-year-old. These are ruts we're producing for them. They are not routes. Temporary changes in pacing have nothing to do with capacity. If you're not struggling, you're not learning. Sometimes we slow down to make sure we get something right. Other times we backtrack because we forgot we didn't know that as well as we did, and we need to go back in order to go forward. Other times we shut down because the learning environment is toxic, and that's perceived to be an internal problem rather than a problem of the context. We've pathologized struggle as if it's a permanent condition, and that is a lie. It is a racist, classist, ableist lie, right? Each of us slows down and speeds up in certain activities on certain days based on certain contextual factors that are outside any of our ability. Tying capacity to pacing is a gross misrepresentation of how humans learn, and then concretizing that judgment into actual systems that sort and segregate is malpractice. It is harm. Remediation rarely produces academic gains in students. Oh, they should be in this struggling group. And then they're always in the struggling group. You don't come out from that group. In track learning, remediated routes become ruts. This has enormous and negative effects on students' aspirations, life trajectories, and opportunities. And you can see it in the way those kids walk into the classroom and how they engage in those classrooms because they know they're carrying a heavy, heavy label on them when they do. That is my thing saying that I am getting close to time here. Awesome. All right. It seems to not want to shut up. There we go. Sorry. All right. Here's another one. I love this cartoon because it demonstrates to me the misrepresentation of human the plasticity in our learning and the possibilities of growth. Oh man, how do you do so well at this practice? Yeah, it must be an innate gift. It must be a gift from God. You must be gifted in some sort of way. Yeah, it's practice. Oh, I'll never understand. Or some people are just so talented. It's a mystery. Yeah, it's practice. That's how all of us get better at anything, right? And access to resources and learning environments that are conducive to that. So lower track students are deprived of opportunity, access, enrichment, resources, acceleration, rigor, challenge, and mobility. Lower tracks tend to get less experienced teachers, less rigorous curriculum, less enrichment opportunities, watered down content, the stigma of low expectations. Tracking tends to weaponize the biases that are already built into the systems. Lower tracks are demoralizing and demotivating, and tracking says, and this is a hard thing to say and hear, we don't think you're worthy of our best efforts and our best resources. We have low expectations of you. Know your place. Now, seems harsh, right? I'm telling you, talk to kids about how they experience those labels, get them to talk honestly about it. And I've done this. This is what they will tell you in their own words. Schools tend not to be the great equalizer. Instead, they tend to be the great sorter, ranker, and segregator. And it also broadcasts to other kids. You know, most of you know, whether you know it or not, you fall into this category. You are now untalented. Like, how harsh is that, right? It also broadcasts to those in the higher tracked classes that they lose out on exposure to diverse perspectives, ways of knowing, real world problem solving, and deeper learning skills that peak in multicultural, rich, diverse settings. For those placed in higher tracks, tracking supplies them with a problematic, if not a dangerous rationale for their unearned status and advantage. And it also promotes an internalized superiority for privileged students that encourages their own silence and complicity as they see how the game is stacked. Right? Tracking also divides communities and contributes to the increasing polarization in our nation, where some kids are left behind on purpose so that other kids can accelerate. And you get to see it in this cartoon. Well, the feds have authorized me to leave your child behind, because tracking is, even though Brown v. Board and everything else, tracking is fully legal. Now, I'll finish. Tracking betrays to a host of ills, like all these things, research. There are dissertations and books and articles you can find all over the place where students' experiences of being tracked are linked to these quote unquote misbehaviors or these externalizing behaviors in all other places. And if you haven't studied one yet and you know it's linked to something else, there's your dissertation or your next book, because there are, I'm sure, other things that can be linked to. And tracking is actually clearly and fervently opposed by leading organizations. The National Governors Association, the College Board, National Education Association, National Association of Secondary School Principals, Middle School, English teachers, math teachers, the California Department of Education, Massachusetts State Legislature, the Carnegie Council. All these organizations have very passionate and public statements that are against tracking, and yet we continue to see institutions that support it. So robust alternatives already exist. If you're going to remove a load-bearing wall, you got to replace it with something. Competency-based education is great. Harvard has something called success planning that's very well studied and well developed. Stanford has their thing called complex instruction that's meant to differentiate instruction to remove tracking. Kentucky and Rhode Island have individualized learning plans that's built into statute in the state, and the systems and schools are required to operationalize it. That is a fantastic way to remove tracking. The New Teacher Project has a Learning Acceleration for All project that does a really beautiful job at it. And Spring Point has academic conferencing in their wealth of resources that they provide. This is just scratching the surface. There's many others that provide really great opportunities to detrack. And the last, and this one's pretty quick, is just about punishment. Just want to say, this is the third big one, third rail with it, where you keep stepping on. What we do in schools, folks, is just not discipline. Discipline ought to signal the intentional and strategic cultivation of a nurturing environment where students learn all sorts of good stuff: empathy, collaboration, personal collective responsibility, diverse constructions of respect, how to build a just, vibrant, responsive environment. This is what we should be helping students to self-discipline and community discipline each other, to learn how to take care of each other and lift each other up, right? How to manage authenticity and the belonging and those tensions and identity development over time. But what we do is not discipline. Typically, when students resist us and make behavioral mistakes, essentially acting their age, we're most invested in threatening, manipulating, excluding, embarrassing, hurting, and shaming them. We do that through our disciplinary strategies in schools. We seem to prefer retribution over restoration, rejection over reconciliation, intimidation over inquiry, and banishment over belonging. Assimilation is more preferred over authenticity, which is why what we do in schools is not really discipline. What we do in schools is punishment. I'm with Rich Milner, former president of the American Educational Research Association, who has a fantastic book where he explores exactly all the myths around discipline and why we really got to stop calling it. We got to call it punishment unless we've reformed that system. Carrots and sticks. Yeah, that's what we try to do all the time in schools. Carrots are the reward system, sticks being the punishment systems. Toxic praise is a carrot we often use. It's very demotivating. Look at Carol Dweck's work. Grades should never be used as rewards. They should be assessments of systems. Reward systems do not work. You can look at the work of Alfie Kohn and all the people who followed it and all the research. Reward systems actually collapse on themselves. Access to opportunity should never be withheld. Why are we withholding that as a punishment for bad performance? Sticks also are some of our weakest tools in the way we want to compel students to make different decisions. Suspensions, we know this. I don't know why I have to say this. It's such an obvious thing, but suspensions don't work to change the behaviors. We keep doing them and doing them and doing them. They're such poor tools for us to use to try to convince students to not do the thing that they're being punished for. In-school suspension is a way to just cook the books in schools and provide a holding tank for the students that teachers least understand and are able to adapt to in the classroom. And referrals are just shame-inducing escapes or badges of honor in most places. Sometimes when it's referrals for extra supports and a great place for you to go and decompress and talk about what's coming up for you in a particular learning environment, then we're in the realm of really good possibility development there. But in general, referrals are, oh, you're going to the office, oh, that sort of shame-inducing escape or badges of honor to all your students. When the student's like, yeah, peace out, I'm out, and look at me, I get to go to the office now. I'm the troublemaker. Not helpful. So our disciplinary categories, and I'm almost done here, are total mess. We keep using terms like insubordination, disruption, disorderly conduct, defiance of authority, and incivility as if we all agree what those terms are when we see them. These categories have no validity and reliability. They're prone to bias, and the way they're recorded actually undermines attempts for us to be precise in our interpretation of student behavior, which facilitates us in reacting to it in ways that are developmentally productive rather than counterproductive. Unchecked bias ensures that the dominant institutions are able to sustain these norms that are designed to secure advantage for the dominant group. In this way, the disproportionality that we see in our disciplinary outcomes is a purposeful outcome. To put a blunt point on that, we tend to reward whiteness when we reward unproblematized good behavior, and we punish unproblematized bad behavior in institutions that haven't examined and interrogated their own dominant tendencies. Students who are BIPOC are more likely to be seen as troublemakers when they misbehave in some way that their white peers don't. That, when exacerbated over time, produces that big disproportionality. So, in conclusion, I think that mistakes, behavioral mistakes, academic mistakes, submission of work to be assessed mistakes are like quantum superpositions. If you know Schrodinger's cat, that cat inside the box is neither alive or dead. The cat is actually both alive and dead because we don't know, and the cat exists in a superposition in a quantum state. What possibilities will we open when we conceive of and think of and react to a mistake and try to do it developmentally? Think of all the different worlds that open for students when we react to it in ways that promote mistakes as stepping stones to possibility rather than punish them or indict them for having made that mistake. Learning through mistake making is a primary activity in reaching our possibility in our adolescents and kids reaching their possibilities. Concretizing mistakes warps growth into injury and aspiration into an indictment. Despite abundant evidence, and man, there's so much, and clear alternatives, and there are so many, these old paradigms and malpractices, grading, punishment, tracking, continue to extinguish possibility, and they're doing it on purpose. We can't, therefore, just build and add compensatory programs, whether it's an after-school program, a summer learning loss program, addressing summer melt, a chronic absenteeism, all these things that are outside or even internal to the school that are trying to compensate for this central forms of harm and foreclosed opportunities that we need to dismantle and abolish. If you're involved in some of those compensatory programs, that doesn't mean those things are bad. It just means that without dismantling and abolitionist strategies to get rid of where the harm is occurring, we're always going to be playing around the edges rather than going to the core. So I will finish there. Again, super psyched to talk about this. Thank you so much for having me. The book where I most outline each one of these things that I spoke about today is Make Me. I'm actually writing the second edition now. So please feel free to use my email address if you have thoughts about what should be included in the second edition, because I'm about neck deep in it and trying to make it happen. I'm excited to chat. Let's talk.
Okay, so we already have a question in the chat, but you can put your questions in the chat, raise your hand, and I can either read questions in the chat or then call on you if you want to speak. So first question I saw in the chat is, it's how can we create a culture of possibility in and out of schools? What does that look like?
I think in some cases, creating a culture around possibility development in schools is absolutely indispensable, but it's completely insufficient, particularly when you are sending all kinds of encouraging messages to students about you can do it, when they never get to be called gifted or talented, and they don't know how they're going to be assessed in order to be successful, and they're continually punished for making behavioral mistakes. No matter what culture you have around that and how you've trained teachers to say different things and do different things, unless you're really taking out those central forms of harm that are very powerful at sending messages that are internalized by students, then whatever culture of possibility you're creating, again, is coming up against that wall of these systems that are producing so much harm. So yes, we can create a culture of possibility. We can do it by talking very differently, not using toxic forms of praise to students that talk about their identities and talking about themselves, but instead engaging them about how they got to be good at that. Hey, I just saw you really nailed it on that last presentation. How did you get to that spot? Tell me what you did to get there. And then you get to be engaged with them as they describe the skills that they used or didn't use. And then you get to say, what are you going to do to be better at it next time, right? Completely different conversation than good job, high five, which tells them nothing. You cannot underestimate the power of frequent feedback, just feedback about how they're doing, what they're doing, when they're doing it, that doesn't get concretized in a grade book and that isn't used to publicly categorize a student as being ready for learning or not ready for learning or ready for the next step or not ready for the next step. Those things are really dangerous for how they can communicate possibilities for students or take away possibilities. So that culture of schools needs a whole lot of belief change. It needs a whole lot of the dialogue change around how we talk and engage students around their work and around their possibilities, but it really has to have the systemic change of getting rid of the features that produce the most harm.
Thank you, Eric. That was powerful.
Yeah, I'm looking at this next question. Do you feel that the current practices of discipline reflect the mindset of the generation that implemented them? Yeah. Whereas now younger generations have learned and understand the prior way of punishing even with our own children is not healthy. Yeah, so there may be some generational differences here. And I am guardedly optimistic that some of the kids who are now growing up with restorative classroom environments and culturally sustaining classroom environments where they know that they get to show up and be authentically them. They don't have to show up as white middle class in order to be taken seriously as an academically successful kid, in order to be taken seriously as a good behaving kid. Like I think that some of those changes that we're seeing, get uptake around the country are definitely going to help with generations over time. The big caveat to that is, to what extent are the institutions that are training educators preparing them to do discipline differently? What is education teaching? Even teaching a course on classroom management is somewhat rare in education programs. And it's often not taught at all to those who are in counseling programs or school social work programs or school psychology programs, so that they're coming around with a very behaviorist orientation about the inducements we need to apply in order to get a student to change their behaviors, instead of the forms of inquiry and the forms of relationship building and the ways that we need to deeply understand before we respond to kids' quote unquote misbehaviors in school. teacher education is not doing a great job in that realm, which is why I'm currently working on a project at Vanderbilt to try to create an open educational resource classroom management course that we want to disseminate around the country to teacher education programs, completely free and transparent, with everything in it, from lecture notes, slide decks, suggested videos, assessment strategies, textbooks to use, readings, how to facilitate those readings in rich learning environments, how to segment that and work with your school supervisor and your mentor teacher and classroom environments to operationalize those things. We're trying to build it because we realize that a lot of the novice teachers and new teachers don't start out in their field knowing how to do these things very well. And so they get wrapped up into veteran cultures, that say things like "don't smile until Thanksgiving" and "my way or the highway" and "don't let the kids get you down." Those are not the approaches that are going to produce the strong, rich, possibility developing disciplinary environments. Yeah.
And I would like to invite Kimberlyn, if you wanted to elaborate on the question you had in the chat, or if you wanted to comment any further, if you'd like.
No, he answered that very well. I like how he said it was insufficient, because people tend to just talk about culture and not get to like the details of how you shift culture. And I really appreciated that.
Okay, awesome.
Thanks, Kimberly.
And Shalane as well, if you had any additional comments or to your question as well.
Okay. Hi, sorry, it took me a minute to get my video to work. No, I just was interested in kind of how you thought, like this progression is going. I'm entering into the Penn graduate program from a criminal justice background, actually, and a master's in that. So, kind of just seeing like even my own upbringing, now as how we deal with our children. I have a 6-year-old, and I know that, when I was growing up, we would have, if we did something wrong, we would have just immediately got spanked. Whereas now, I take my son down and we kind of talk about his behavior, and, why did he do this and why we shouldn't do this, and more of like a holistic, approach. And also on the level of a 6-year-old, as opposed to, I think before, we were treating small people like they should have the cognizance and reactions to things as a full grown adult. So that was why I was kind of like trying to see how you were feeling as, I would say probably like the millennial generation and younger is kind of moving into these higher positions, specifically in education. If you see that that's going to be a cultural shift, or if you think it will stay the same. Especially I think whenever they get into the positions where they can affect, policy and standard operating procedures in the school.
When and where if you want to focus on the millennial generation or even a little bit prior or after, if and when those generations or the individuals in those generational categories have experienced what I would call pretty indulgent environments, where the parenting strategies were more like, I'm my kid's best friend, rather than I keep them safe by providing a very structured environment, and then we negotiate things when we need to, because I'm going to learn stuff from my kid, and I'm going to learn stuff about how to be better at some of this stuff as I grow in my own, parenting journey. When kids come from those sorts of indulgent parenting environments and then go into environments that are either too rigid, or often they might have restorative practices where kids are held very much accountable for their behaviors in ways that are deeply rooted in community building and forms of accountability that are really good for the self, really good for the collective, that can be a jarring difference between I get to do what I want to I don't get to do what I want. And sometimes when I do what I want, it hurts other people, and I'm going to hear from them about how I hurt them when I do it, and that's going to be hard for me. So I'm out. Like, no, you need to stay in the circle. That's what it looks like to be held accountable. We're not shaming you, but we're going to tell you about when you said that in class the other day. This is the impact it had in me and how I feel it in my body, and how it's not going to work for me to have that happen again. So I've heard, and you can see it a lot in popular media, that there are a lot of teachers who are in their first 5 to 10 years of teaching right now who are up and quitting. They're leaving because of, and you see them blame it, the way these kids are parented today is just fill in the blank. And you can find that same argument used in the 1880s, the 1920s, the 1940s, the 1960s. And I mean, it's always the argument about kids these days. So I don't really buy generational arguments about something wrong being in this generation. I do think the challenges associated with cell phones right now are they're very different than having access to a VCR or video games and stuff. I think when you have thousands and thousands of people behind this phone that are trying to get kids to never leave their phone, that's a different environment, and it's having its impacts that were all well documented at this point. But I don't think generational arguments are very compelling for me. I think what's most compelling is watch what kids can do, watch what teachers can do when they're properly prepared to be as engaged in taking care of each other as they are in advocating for themselves. When you create environments where that is the ethic, everyone around will be blown away at what kids can do, because they know how to act with maturity because they're given the structures that enable them to do it. When they're only reprimanded, then they know really well how to reprimand, and that ends up being an FU in the class, right? That's just a reprimand. That's their reprimand of you. We taught them how to do that. They're just using the F word. We hopefully didn't use the F word. But this whole cyclical nature of the way that kids are behaving is precisely what we've taught them to do. Put them in an environment where they understand their own sense of self-accountability and other accountability, and man, it's a beautiful sight.
Thank you.
I want to get to Betsy's question. Hi, Betsy. Betsy and I go way back.
Hey, how are you? It's been a minute.
Super good. It's so great to see you.
It's nice to see you. I'll tell you, I'll say my question, or I'll say my thought here. Or I'm just so struck listening to this conversation about punishment and like seeing failure as, definitive. I work a lot with novice teachers and with novice school leaders, and my God, it's the same, right? So I'm thinking about like, how can we think about like the practices that can support a professional culture that interrupts that? Because if that's what the adults are experiencing, then they're just going to keep doing it to the kids.
Yeah. So one practice that I have been guilty of participating in, if not perpetuating, is the expert that comes in to do professional development for a particular staff. As awesome as I can be, I mean, crazy good, right? It's really a bad model. It's really a bad model because it's a couple of people on a committee who decided they liked an article that I wrote or a thing or something. And so they pull me in and I get to do a full day long or maybe a year-long thing or whatever. And the problem with that is that it's disempowering for those who didn't choose me or that topic, or I'm not at the edge of where they need to go, or I'm far beyond of the edge of where they need to go. And when I show up, I alienate them and scare them. And so it's a bad model. If you really want to meet teachers and support staff and administrators where they're at, they need to be held at the level of where their struggle is. Where is their edge right now, and what do they want to get better at? And then what should they be held accountable for too? There should be some stuff that's not just self-driven, but it's also institutional driven. Like teachers should be pretty good at assessment. Teachers should be pretty good at classroom management. They should be pretty good at developing relationships with students and those sets of criteria, right? But they should be able to say, I just feel like I keep hitting a wall with this one and I'm not good at, I need help doing this. And then 8 or 9 other teachers say, I need help doing this too. Awesome, make it a project. What do you want to do? How can I support you? But it's teacher and it's educator driven forms of professional development that's based upon where they see their needs of growth. The huge caveat to that is that can be an echo chamber. If someone really needs help and not having such bad practices with A, B, C, or D, but they don't think they do, part of what needs to be built into that is accessing how students feel and the way that they're growing in the learning environment and using that as a key data point. If students are saying, dude, I don't feel safe in your classroom. I know you think it's awesome the way you do it, but I don't feel good in here. Then that's enough for a group of teachers or a school to be able to say, this teacher needs some help in doing this stuff and we're going to help them with that. So it can't just be solely teacher driven. It also needs to be built on deep engagements with our main clientele, which is students and families and how they feel and experience our work. If those two things are happening and teachers are put in charge and make it a project that they have to then report back the things that they're learning and the things that they're doing differently, we're off to the races. Whether it's professional learning communities, networked improvement communities, all the rad Carnegie School stuff that they do around the country, those thumbs up about all those things.
Okay. Next, we have Liza, if you wanted to ask your question live, or I could ask it. Whatever you'd like.
Thanks. And I think Eric just answered it, but my question is, where have you seen this ethic in action? And you mentioned an ethic, and I guess I'm packing into that, both accessing student feelings, distributed accountability, kind of educator-driven PD, high-touch feedback, PLCs. You just mentioned Carnegie. So is there any other places that you'd like to kind of highlight that come to mind?
Yeah, there are a few places that are my go-to happy places. So I'll mention a few of those because they're really just sites of absolute beautiful possibility development, often with populations that are least served in traditional learning environments. So I'll mention a few of them and tell you why. One is Boston Day and Evening Academy in Dorchester. The staff, the work that they do together, the kinds of kids that they serve there, the way that they've structured the school. Every time I've been there, and I've probably been there half a dozen times now and spent days hanging out in classrooms with kids and teachers and going to faculty meetings and stuff. It is so beautiful and powerful. And they're serving students who have failed out of school, have been pushed out of school, non-traditional students who maybe have aged out. They may be 18 or 19 and they're doing their GDE sort of stuff, but they still need to go to school to get those things, and they can't just all be done online. These are kids who are experiencing homelessness. These are immigrants and refugees. It's a students, the populations there are kids who are most exposed to resource extraction and the depletion of possibility because of their social location. And they just do beautiful work there. Allison Ramick, the head of school, is a visionary, and what she does with her staff continues to be just amazing. So that would be a place. Go visit it next time you're in Boston. Tell Allison I said hi. Go into a classroom, and this is what they do when you walk in the door, and this is a sign of a good school. They say, don't talk to us. Who cares what the adults think? Just go sit down and talk to kids. Just come on in, go sit down and talk to kids about what they're doing. And this kind of stuff that you'll get from the kids in the environment there, it just says so much. I get chills thinking about it. Another place is High Tech High and its group of schools in Southern California, but kind of expanding across the state now with their model. The High Tech High Graduate School of Education and High Tech High in general there. Their approach, which is competency-based, it's super based in culturally sustaining forms of education. Their populations that they serve come from a whole host of places in the greater San Diego ecosystem. And they're just really, really, really solid in what they do. Project-based learning, PLCs for everyone that are, intergrade level, inter-subject level, so you don't just get in the content or the echo chamber of your own department or your own grade level. How they design exhibitions of learning and their expeditionary learning there is absolutely incredible. Just beautiful, beautiful things happening there. And they're really good at hosting visits and doing site visits for educators to come see what kids can do when they're really supported. The same for the Met in Providence. Spent multiple days at the Met. They also do absolutely gorgeous things with expeditionary learning, competency-based education. And they have always been at the root of a lot of what's possible with detracking, what's possible with really good forms of discipline in schools, what's possible with reforming grading and the way that they do and don't do grades at that school. Again, beautiful place to visit. Others that I would suggest would be Kenowa Hills in Michigan is a district that's really posting some beautiful changes. They're a competency-based school that also does a lot of really justice-based reforms. Same with Lindsay Unified in the Central Valley in California. Henry County Schools, just outside of Atlanta, was a big leader years ago in doing a lot of these changes that I've been mentioning. Beautiful, beautiful stuff there. Some of the people that were leaders in that are now leaders at the University of Kentucky and at the CIE there, the Institute there for Innovation and Education. Henry County Schools outside of Atlanta, beautiful, beautiful stuff there. And I could go on, but those are some of the favorite places that I visited or people that I know who have led some of the work there. Yeah.
I would like to ask a question about, so I think of this from a college access perspective and in school counseling adjacent roles where you're meeting a student in 11th or 12th grade and you have their transcript in front of you, their disciplinary record, and then you're supposed to help them make sense of it and then have that define their future possibilities. And I imagine there's a lot of abolishing and deconstructing that needs to happen in our post-secondary planning process. But just coming from a school counseling perspective, what role do you believe school counselors can have in advocating for these changes in schools, or what role can the school counselor have in advancing greater advocacy in these areas for students?
Yeah, and this is where I'm really hopeful, because the skills that are taught in a good counseling program lead counselors, and I'll say school support professionals, so I'll try to be inclusive of school psychologists and social workers as well, and also counselors. But so I'm going to kind of lump those three together, even though there are some important distinctions there. That they are trained in many ways and prepared and supported to think about the student first, to not think about the lesson plan first, to not think about the unit plan first, to not think about the test on Friday first, but to think about the student first and about how to engage that particular individual at the level of their meaning making, their identity formation, their access to resources, their family environment, what they bring with them to school in terms of assets and potential deficits, what they bring from school back home in terms of assets and deficits. They're much more prepared to think about that exchange rather than thinking in a rather limited way pedagogically or thinking about disciplinarily about those things. The problem is then they then get into institutions where then they're siloed and their stuff is squishy and touchy-feely, whereas the real stuff is the grades and the discipline. And so they're not at the table when someone's making decisions about a particular kid's life trajectory based upon the grades that they're not doing, when the counselor could say, you should hear the way that Jimmy talks about your class when Jimmy comes to my office. Or the last time I talked to Jimmy when I saw him at the basketball game, these are the things that I know he's good at. How come we're not talking about that with him? Why are we just talking about the fact that he skipped 2 homeworks? We need to get underneath that, right? We need more of the child advocate at the front of the conversation rather than trying to compensate for grading and punishment regimes that are the labeling problem. I think many people who are trained in the fields that I've mentioned are used to troubling labeling regimes. The problem I will say with that is that some of the ways that school psychologists in particular are given instruments to say, here's this 15-item survey. If you use this with a kid, we'll then know the following about that kid. And I just want to encourage all of the school psychologists counselors, please go read all of the research about whatever instrument you're using and all of the critics of it and all of the people, even read the limitations in the study of the people who invented it and read the ways that it should be used and the ways that it should not be used, because there are a lot of instruments and assets and inventories that we use in schools that have a pretty problematic history and are often misused with the way that they are designed or the way that they're implemented and applied in schools. So be careful of just using this thing or that thing in the school because that's what your district always does. There's probably someone out there who's found some serious faults with some of those instruments, and you need to have an open conversation about whether that's serving your needs and helping kids to achieve and open possibilities for them. Because sometimes they're not designed to do that, particularly when it's intelligence that you're measuring.
Awesome, thank you. We have time for about one to two more questions.
Jackie, this is Mike. Eric just a tremendous pleasure to hear your thinking on all of these issues and your work in this regard. A couple of things that I would throw out there for consideration. The impact of higher education in enabling these tracking systems, because there are pathways to elite universities from private schools.
Yep.
So even elite private schools are part of the segregation process, socioeconomically and otherwise. And it's encouraged, highly encouraged by our most elite institutions.
Yep.
So how do you think about that? And then a second point is a compliment to make me that I hear from students is know me. I'll work with you if you know who I am. So just a small step in the possibility development process is knowing our students genuinely, not just saying we know them, but really trying to learn who they are. Those are two different issues, but take on either one you choose, if you would.
As is the case often with listening to things that you say, Mike, I got chills when you said know me. That's a beautiful encapsulation of what's so critical in that. First seek to know me before you make a decision about whether my behavior was good or bad. First ask me, what's going on? How are you? First check in with me. First get to know me as a person before you make determinations about my potential. In fact, maybe don't make any determinations about my potential at all. Just keep opening things in front of me for me, please. But know me. I just love that. That authenticity, belonging tension is so present for particularly for adolescents. How do I get to be radically me, but also be included in the they? And how do I manage that tension? And they are not good at managing it because, I'm 55. I'm super good at managing it now. Not like, how is it that a 13-year-old learns to manage that well? They're not going to do it elegantly. Sometimes they will, but early on, it's going to be really problematic and fraught and anxiety producing. Knowing them and being able to engage them at the level of their feelings, the level of their culture, the level of their beliefs and aspirations, the level of their fears will give you enormous tools as an educator, however you define, to be able to find the inroads in to help them make those next decisions. I just love it that you said that, Mike. I get chills most of the times you say rad things. So the other thing about, elite private schools, we're probably not going to be dismantling those anytime soon. And we can see currently a pretty significant retrenchment in the conservative agenda to create school choice or voucher systems, which is another way to defund public education, but also create schools that are solely self-selecting and that do what's called creaming. It's a common byproduct of that type of approach, and that's intentional because that will produce schools that, for all intents and purposes, function as segregation academies in our communities. How do we do that? One of the ways, how do we disrupt some of that? How do we do that? There's a thing called the Mastery Transcript Consortium. It's a group of states and districts and district consortia around the country that have shown that we can get rid of grades and ranks in schools by creating mastery transcripts where it's no longer a B- in algebra. It's actually a list of the competencies that student has been able to demonstrate at either a good enough level or at an exceeds expectations level, and that those competencies are communicated in a transcript that universities accept. In fact, at this point, state schools around the country and elite schools are quite used to getting mastery transcripts and are quite adept in being able to read those in ways that produce admissions decisions that are often more equitable than grades and SAT scores. But it's sort of a well-known, it's not a well-known secret. It's too many people don't know that. They think that, well, if we move to a gradeless transcript, none of our kids are going to get into college. They won't get into elite schools. It's quite the opposite. The Mastery Transcript Consortium, which has created policy around the country, has supported that. Another big move to help shift this conversation and to help shift what people see is the portraits of a graduate. When you get communities that congeal around creating, this is what we want a student to know and be able to do. We want their knowledge and skills and dispositions to look like this at the end. and then backwards map what they need to do to get students like that. And the whole community is involved in creating that portrait of graduate. The outcomes from that, when that process is done really well and in culturally responsive and inviting and inclusive ways, it's really amazing, particularly when competency-based forms of education are then created, restorative programs are then created, and assessment regimes are thrown out and replaced with detracking environments. And you can see the portraits of a graduate getting taken up around the country at the district, school, and even at the state level, and Kentucky and Rhode Island being among the leaders there. So I think Portraits of a Graduate offer some hope for dismantling some of the tendencies for the segregation among schools to do that. And I also think that looking at the Mastery Transcript Consortium is a way to level the playing field a little bit.
Thank you, Eric. Fabulous.
And Eric, do you have time for one more comment from Andrew?
Yeah.
Eric, this has been really fantastic, and I've really enjoyed it. So much here, really. It's there's just chock full of just fantastic insights and so much to learn from. I just have a quick comment that as a member of school board here in suburban Philadelphia, and
thank you for your service.
well, thanks. Yeah, I always get a kick out of when people comment or write into us and say that our salaries should be cut for our decisions. And like, by the way, we don't make a salary,
Yeah.
volunteers. But you know, our district is normally ranked really high. And of course, that is the result of the kind of history that you've been talking about, and something that try to recognize or talk about in public when possible, that about redlining or separation, or making school districts, let's say that funding is per pupil and it's based on property taxes. It really increases inequality. But what I just want to say quickly is that for anyone watching or listening, that every single one of Eric's insights today, I can find relevance in as a school board director. That we make decisions all the time about belonging initiatives, about student discipline, about special curricula, consolidating curricula across levels to streamline teaching and learning.
Yeah.
These are all highly relevant topics that really affect the day-to-day. And I just want to really stress that again, at the level of district governance, decisions are being made about these topics all the time. Yeah. So I just want to commend you and just really underline how relevant everything that you've talked about today is for my work as a school board director, and also as a parent, you know, in the community. So I just want to say thank you. If you have any comments on that, cool. But if not, I just wanted to mention that.
I appreciate that, Andrew. And in my experience, there's typically a hungry and quite receptive crew of people who have seen the systemic features that are producing these forms of perpetual harm and are seeking ways to change it, and are so busy that they don't know how, or they haven't yet troubled all the beliefs that are behind it, but they know something's wrong and they can smell it and they just need to go there, and they're waiting for brave leaders like yourself and others to name it and show what needs to change and start helping people replace it. That said, there's always a strong, virulent, and vocal crew who are committed to keeping things the way they are because of what it does for them and what it does for the dominant group or groups. And getting into that dismantling and abolitionist work without being prepared for the backlash and without being prepared with strong messaging and strategies and a ground game, you're going to get run out of town. It's hard work, and you're going to scare people, and they're going to think you're a Marxist. And
I've been called that.
Yeah, right. And you're going to get called all kinds of names. I'm on a couple of lists around the country as being part of the Ed Illuminati. I'm on a list of a white nationalist group as being part of the DEI critical race theory indoctrination crew. And like, I consider it a badge of honor that I popped up like that, but know that the backlash will be virulent and that it will be there. And if you don't prepare for it, you're going to get run out of town because people get scared. So if you want to go there, please do, but get your ground game going.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.